difficult thing to introduce someone. How does one sufficiently encapsulate in words who a person is or what kind of artist they are? Anything you say can feel grossly insufficient. This is especially the case with Angelica Davila. As a person of many talents, she somehow makes it all seem so easy, and it is difficult to decide where to start listing her accomplishments. It would seem fitting, given our current occasion, to focus mainly on her writing at the expense of other pursuits, and I tend to do so for the sake of time. However, this would only be a small part of the person that is Angelica. I would be loath not to at least mention her other talents, which include stand-up and improv. I will say, if you're looking for a treat, attend one of her frequent shows around the city. See her for details. My own shameless plug on her behalf. But while her stand-up and improv are certainly worth your time, you don't have to attend a show to experience her unique humor and perceptive take on topics ranging from the everyday to mental illness and her Latina identity. Her comedic talent emanates throughout her writing, and in particular her fiction, in which the absurd and even grotesque intertwine to hold a mirror to the world. This is particularly evident in her short story, May Cause Nausea, in which her protagonist, Maricela, drives other people in her life, including her boyfriend and therapist, to their breaking points due to her incessant state of happiness. Taken literally, certain pressures to smile more, just be happy, and other ways people respond to those experiencing depression, Angelica upends these expectations and reveals the futility and absurdity of other, particularly male characters' attempts to control Maricela's emotions. Instead of appreciating her positive attitude and joy, both Clyde and Dr. Garcia want her to be unhappy like them, because this to them would be more normal. While Clyde, increasingly obsessed with a Zoloft commercial, goes to ridiculous lengths to draw a reaction from Maricela, Dr. Garcia takes to postulating reasons for this patient's constant smiling, including poor babies crying for milk, or tax fraud. While comical in the ways these characters react to Maricela's happiness, Angelica's story, through its absurdity, resonates and provides striking commentary on both society's expectations for women and those experiencing mental illness, but also the human condition, as unwarranted happiness cannot be fathomed in a world seemingly preoccupied with not feeling okay. Besides her humor, though, one thing that has always stood out in Angelica's work is her willingness to play with language and form. While her poetry contemplates bilingual and Latina identity, seamlessly blending languages into a unique voice, her novel manuscript, Somos, delving into similar themes, employs a wide range of forms in its narrative, from screenplay to lyric, revealing both an inventiveness and an admirable courage to defy convention that is characteristic of both her writing and herself as a person. Angelica is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the program for writers here at UIC, where she's also received her MA. She is the recipient of the 2012 Kate Herzog Award from Willamette Writers, and her work has appeared in journals such as the National, the Stink Review, and Lover's Eye Press. Without further ado, please welcome Angelica Davila.
Thank you. And also thank you for the shameless plug of the other things I do. I'm going to read an excerpt from my short story that Dan touched on in his introduction. The story is called May Cause Nausea. So here we go. The round ball was depressed. He exaggerated a sigh, which contradicted the happy-go-lucky music playing in the empty white background. The ball existed in an animated void. Moments later, a hand-drawn cloud appeared above the round ball and proceeded to follow it as the ball sluggishly bounced. A loud voice boomed overhead and narrated the depressed ball's life. The narrator claimed that the ball felt alone, and the round ball preferred the narrator mind his own business. A blue bird flew past, but the round ball didn't even bat an eye. Yes, the round ball had two sad eyes and yet no mouth. The hand-drawn cloud disappeared above the ball and gave way to drawings that resembled sperm, but not quite, with the text that read, Nerve A and Nerve B. These nerves exchanged little dots between them, and it all looked French to the round ball. The narrator explained that Zoloft would solve the round ball's depression. The round ball was unsure, but the script demanded he be the opposite of depressed. A mouth appeared a bit below its eyes, and it bared its teeth to form a crooked smile. Teeth on loan. Clyde couldn't fall asleep. He kept replaying the Zoloft commercial in his head from earlier in the night. Clyde wondered why the round ball had been depressed. Why didn't the round ball simply bounce? Bouncing made Clyde happy. He wondered if the round ball felt alone because the other round balls ignored him. Was it even a bad thing for the round ball to be depressed? Did the round ball understand its place in the universe? Most importantly, how did the Zoloft ball have sex? Maricela slept soundly next to Clyde as he pondered about the round ball's sex life. The two had had sex earlier that night. Clyde imagined it had been more enjoyable than the sex that the round ball would ever have, if it could. Yet Clyde was still unhappy. Clyde was tired of the darkness and the lack of sleep. He turned the TV back on. On the TV, Smiling Bob, a man in his late 50s, dressed as a balding middle white suburbia, appeared. He was happy again because he was boning his wife. His wife was happy because Smiling Bob was boning her. Smiling Bob boned his wife because he was happy. Smiling Bob walked everywhere with a smile and evidently a boner. All his neighbors and friends knew his secret. Enzyte was the male enhancer that allowed Smiling Bob to smile and Mrs. Smiling Bob to also smile comically as soon as he arrived home from work with his boner. With the flicker on the TV in the background, Clyde turned to glance at Maricela. She had a sheepish grin on her sleeping face. There were two things that Clyde was certain about. One, Maricela was unusually happy, and two, this meant that there was something inevitably wrong with her, because no one could really be happy. Clyde knew people could seem happy, but beneath it, there had to be a reason for someone to bitch about something. The round ball was back on the TV. The same commercial repeated at least 15 times between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Clyde watched the round ball depressingly bounce around again, all while wondering, am I depressed? Frustrated at himself for even thinking the thought, he reached for the remote to turn off the TV. No, he thought, I am normal. This is what normal feels like. Dr. Garcia was certain about two things. One, Maricela was unusually happy, and two, this meant that there was something inevitably wrong with her. He had reached the same conclusion that Clyde had about Maricela without ever having met him. The certificates on Dr. Garcia's office were there to remind his clients of how much more he knew than them. These certificates meant nothing to Maricela, though, considering how she took his observation of her condition with a grain of salt. This was her 8th weekly session with him, and she was still the same as each previous week. She sat on the sofa across from Dr. Garcia's armchair with her legs crossed and hands on her lap, and that big, goofy smile that annoyed him so much. It was the same big, goofy smile she had the previous week, and the week before that, and the week before that, going all the way to her first session. Both Maricela and Dr. Garcia were silent. They had moments of silence every now and then, but that big, goofy smile with a slight overbite could scream in the doctor's ears. Maricela had started seeing Dr. Garcia due to a misunderstanding at work. The misunderstanding went down as follows. A. Bethany, who had fallen behind on an advertising campaign for a major pharmaceutical company, asked Maricela if she could help her finishing her strategic report, just as Maricela was walking past her office. Maricela had said, sure, I'd love to, with a giant smile before turning abruptly and walking down in the direction she had come from, presumably back to her own office. B. Claire, who was turning the corner of the hallway, overheard and mistook Maricela's overeagerness for sarcasm. She popped into Bethany's office and made the comment, wow, the sass on her. C. Bethany then spent hours overanalyzing Maricela's I'd love to and overeagerness rather than work on her end of the report. This in return led to Maricela taking over the advertising campaign for said major pharmaceutical company, which led to Claire saying, wow, the nerve of her, to Bethany regarding Maricela, which led to the paperclip altercation in the supply room. D. The paperclip altercation involving Bethany asking Maricela if she could retrieve some paperclips from the supply room. Maricela had responded with, I'd love to, with a giant grin. The I'd love to and the grin were the final straw for Bethany, who followed Maricela to the supply room and then proceeded to knock all the bins of paper clips onto the floor in a state of rage. Hearing the commotion, Claire went to the supply room and saw Bethany lunge at Maricela. I mean, who wouldn't blame her, Claire had said. Maricela totally tested her. E, HR got involved and determined that both Bethany and Maricela needed to complete a counseling session each. Bethany for her anger issues, Maricela for whatever it was she had. During Maricela's first session with the doctor, he had asked her if her unusual state of happiness ever caused other problems in her life outside of work. She had stated her live-in boyfriend, Clyde, had made comments here and there. Dr. Garcia then recommended that she keep coming back to work to the root of her condition, despite how one session satisfied HR. Now, in her 8th session, Dr. Garcia found himself staring at Maricela with contempt. She was smiling still, always smiling. "Did you do the journaling I asked you to do?" he asked. Maricela nodded, smile still present. She reached over to her bag and pulled out a notebook. "Ah, very well. I'm glad that you're finally taking this more seriously," Dr. Garcia said. "Let me see what you wrote down." Maricela passed him the notebook. "This week, things that made me sad, nada. This week, things that made me mad, nada." Dr. Garcia furrowed his eyebrows. "Maricela, you have nothing underneath these categories." "Correct," she said. Her eyes were bright and that goofy smile ever present. She shrugged slightly. "I mean, I tried, Doc. I really did. I'm just happy." Dr. Garcia frowned. He passed her back the notebook and then grabbed his own notepad, in which he scribbled the following notes. "Reasons that people smile. Birthdays, cake and birthdays with balloons. Not clowns. Puppies, kittens, puppies snuggling with kittens, kittens and puppies snoring together, having sex in the morning before work. Reasons why Maricela smiles. Probably because somewhere in the world there is a poor baby crying for breast milk. Translation, she must have been horrible for having any reason to smile while newborns in the world cry for milk." His own notes had become therapeutic for himself during his sessions with Maricela, where he found himself increasingly more and more tested by her. He placed his notepad and pen down and returned his eyes to Maricela. "Why is it that you think you don't have a problem?" Maricela gave him a puzzled expression. "Well, I'm not depressed. Isn't that good enough?" He did not appreciate her stubborn attitude. "Yes, but bearing other human emotions can lead to disastrous consequences. May I remind you about what happened in the supply room at your job?" "But Doc, that seems like," she made air quotes for her fingers, "disastrous consequence was really Bethany's own human emotions and not mine." Dr. Garcia cleared his throat. "Your unusual happiness had a disastrous effect on your coworker. Tell me, what exactly do you have to be so happy about?" "I told you already, I'm just happy." "Without getting promoted at your job?" he asked. "Correct." "Without your boyfriend proposing to you?" "Correct." "And you haven't won the lottery?" "No." "Did you trick the IRS?" He was ever persistent. "No," she replied. "I don't even recall what triggered my happiness. It just happened. It was almost as if someone had whispered in my ear and told me to be happy. And I decided to agree." "Ah, so now you're hearing voices, are you?" "No, it's not anything like that." Dr. Garcia paid no attention to her. He grabbed his pen and scribbled furiously into his notepad. "Reasons why Maricela smiles. Tax fraud. Note to self. Alert the IRS into her suspicious behavior. Side note. Does tax fraud count as an act of terrorism? If terrorism is dangerous against the government, then isn't tax fraud the same? Perhaps waterboarding may help us discover the source of Maricela's abhorrent happiness." "Well then, do you mind explaining how it is even possible for someone to be so happy for so long for no apparent reason?" Dr. Garcia asked. Maricela laughed softly. "Look, I wish I knew. I really do." She turned her head and stared at the office's long window. The vertical blinds were pulled to the side, allowing the natural light to enter the room. Dr. Garcia's office was located on the 6th floor, and she knew that he wished she would just leave. Whenever Maricela stared out of Dr. Garcia's window during their session, she wondered whether any of his patients ever contemplated crashing through the window's glass to end their problems. She imagined standing on the ledge of the window, her fingers would feel tingly and her toes would become numb. What would the doctor do? Would he grab her and pull her back into the office, or would he push her, helping her? If Maricela was to make a list of reasons to jump out of Dr. Garcia's office window, the first thing on that list would be that it would make him happy, and frankly, that man could use some cheering up. Everyone was always trying to dampen her happiness. When Maricela first began to exhibit her strange behavior, Clyde hadn't minded. He listened to her ramble about how great life was, how for a while he had been happy too. Maricela began to take on hobbies such as cooking and knitting. It had been pleasant coming home to a home-cooked meal. Yet Clyde soon became tired of her nonstop glee. Whenever he saw her smile, his stomach would lurch. He missed her complaining about trivial things like washing the dishes, flushing the toilet for him. He now craved for her to nag him about not taking out the trash, for her to say her coworkers were bitches. He wanted her to start a fight with him. He wanted her to feel miserable. In fact, Clyde couldn't stand being around Maricela anymore. He began to look for ways to remain at work longer. Sometimes he would even get on the L only to get off at the next stop and wait for another train and repeat this process until he got home. Other times he snuck around their one-bedroom condo on tiptoe to avoid detection. He frequented their bathroom a lot when he felt trapped at home with her. The more coffee he drank, the more trips he made to the bathroom, which meant the less time he spent with Maricela. During one of those bathroom trips, Clyde sat on the toilet, pants down to his ankles. He noticed the toilet paper was lopsided and fixed it. Unsatisfied with this, he then returned it to its lopsided stage. Pants still around his ankles, he smiled. An oddity for him in the past few weeks. His smile faded quickly, though. He grabbed the toilet paper roll and flung it across the bathroom. He pulled up his pants, and before washing his hands, he decided to rub his unwashed hands around all the surfaces of the bathroom. It wasn't enough, though. The germs from his dirty hands simply wouldn't do. Clyde decided he would have to do something completely heinous to make Maricela react. He grabbed the trash bin and flung its contents around the bathroom. When he was done, he did the next thing he could think of. He grabbed a wad of clean toilet paper and smeared some of his feces from the toilet onto the wall. If art was meant to evoke a response, then this was art because he hoped Maricela would react. He hoped her response would be anger, sadness, shock, annoyance, etc., anything but the damn old happiness she kept exhibiting. Noticing that his fingers still had feces on them, Clyde ensured that his hands were properly clean and washed off. He exited the bathroom with a gleeful smile. He was almost like Smiling Bob, except Smiling Clyde did not smile because he was boning Maricela. Smiling Clyde smiled because he had smeared his poop against the bathroom walls of the inexpensive condo Maricela paid for. Poop. Clyde chuckled to himself. He approached Maricela, who was reading a book on their balcony. When she looked up, Clyde hesitated. That never-ending smile of hers, he couldn't help but think how easily he could push her over the balcony's railing had she been standing instead of sitting. He could have framed it as an accident. The scenarios were limitless. Scenario number 1, Maricela stands up to hug Clyde. He pretends to go for a hug, but then last minute pushes her forward. Maricela loses her balance and falls over the balcony. Her last words, "Don't forget to take the chicken out of the freezer." Scenario number 2, Clyde casually places his arm around Maricela as he sits down next to her. She, trusting him, leans against him and breathes a sigh of happiness. Clyde then snaps her neck before dumping her over the railing. The news headline, "Woman falls to her death from the 3rd floor, snapping her neck in the process. Husband says he warned her not to chase the squirrel." Scenario number 3, Clyde does nothing. Maricela continues to be happy. Clyde decides to go clean up the mess he made in the bathroom. His defending words, "The dog did it," despite having no dog. Clyde brushed all the scenarios out of his mind, says, "I'm going for a walk." "Okay," Maricela said, without even looking at him. So I'll end there. The story is a bit longer than that. That's a bit of a taste into, I guess, some of the humor that I use in stories. So yeah, anyway, now I have the pleasure of introducing Juan Martinez, who, thank you very much for coming to our one-on-one reading. Where literature gets weird. This is exactly how I would describe Juan Martinez's short story collection, Best Worst American. Where literature gets weird is often used to define, for example, fabulous literature. And how else can one describe the collection's first story, Roadblock? In this story, an aunt and her adult nephew are forced to live together after every other member of their family dies in a series of unfortunate and separate airplane accidents. But it gets weirder. The aunt keeps setting the nephew's belongings on fire. Roadblock is where literature gets weird. In correspondences between the lower world and old men in pinstripe suits, a computer technician recovers the ramblings of a man who believes that the world is run by old men in pinstripe suits and who seek smart women to replace them. Another example of where literature gets weird. And let's not forget the story, The Spooky Japanese Girl Is There For You, where, as the title states, the spooky Japanese girl from Japanese horror films is there for you, the reader. Where literature gets weird. But how exactly does Best Worst American get weird? During a conversation in the Author Talks podcast by the American Writers Museum, Juan Martinez states that there is a part of him that loves literary fiction while also loving, quote, trashy horror fiction and also trashy horror movies. He then elaborates that, quote, there's a lot of stuff that you can say in those genres that I think is just fun, but also it gives you license to think, step over the boundaries of good taste. Martinez then mentions and attributes the quote, good taste is the enemy of art to Picasso to reinforce the limitations of neatly crafted fiction. Martinez's explanation of what blurring the lines of good taste and horror elements remained with me. There is something discomforting about trashy horror fiction and movies, and equally something discomforting about literature that wants to break away from the carefully crafted mold that sometimes literary fiction can be. Discomfort is also the very recurring feeling that readers may feel when engaging with Best Worst American. The nearby houses in the story Northern, for example, remain unoccupied, yet fully occupied. The eeriness of suburban life distorted through elements of horror cause a discomfort within the reader. Discomfort is a feeling that the reader cannot escape throughout this short story collection. Of his collection, Juan Martinez told the Author Talks podcast that it is the very strange experience of what it's like to be both in love with the US and also figuring out what your place is. There is no doubt that the discomfort that needs to be embedded in this collection then has to occur. The characters within the collection can be described as the oddballs that society overlooks, a representation of the marginalized, if you will, those who don't fit into the carefully crafted mold of the US. The reader then needs to experience such discomfort because these overlooked characters embody discomfort in their very existence. In an interview with The Rumpus, Martinez stated that he found discomfort to be a wonderful engine for stories, not only in terms of characters who live in physical and existential discomfort, but also in terms of story aesthetics. He elaborates, you pack a narrative and you edit, you hone, you get the elements of the story spun till they're coiled into each other. But part of the fun is letting it get a little sloppy. Sloppy but not boring, or sloppy but not too sloppy. So it's not just this existential internal discomfort for the characters, but an aesthetic of discomfort for the story as a whole, which I think can be too much unless you're willing to also go for funny. And let me tell you, while discomfort reigns within Martinez's story collection, humor allows for actual reflection from the reader. Humor helps one cope and perhaps find the balance between loving the US and feeling out of place within it. I don't want to give too much away of Best Worst American because I do want everyone to be able to experience for themselves, but just be prepared to delve into the fringes of society and the mind when you do read it. It is my pleasure, though, however, to introduce Juan Martinez here, who is author of not only the story collection Best Worst American, but he does have an upcoming horror novel extended stay published by the University of Arizona's Press, Camino del Sol series. Many of his works have been published in McSweeney's, Tri-Quarterly, Glimmer Train, Santa Monica Review, Norton Sudden Fiction Latino, and elsewhere. Juan Martinez is also currently an associate professor of English at Northwestern University. And from what I understand, he is a major Vladimir Nabokov fan as well. So welcome.
Angelica, that was awesome. I love that piece. I want to hear the rest of it. Has it found a home yet, or is it?
Has not found a home yet, still looking.
Okay. Well, it's gonna find a home. Anyway, that was awesome. Thank you. And that was a wonderful introduction. Chris was right. You all really do the best introductions. Thank you. That was really, really cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and read two things. They're both really brief. The first is the very, very, very beginning of the novel that is going to be the horror novel that's coming out in 2023, the beginning of 2023, and then something else. So I'm just going to go ahead and start, and then I'm keeping it brief because I'm just really excited about getting to talk with all of you and with Angelica and everything else. So here I go. The novel is called Extended Stay. This section is very first. It's part one. It's called Courier, Colombia. And here we go. This is chapter one. Alvaro's family was singing his baby sister Alba included, but they stopped when the Fiat stopped. Carmen would have said something, she'd have gotten them in trouble, but she wasn't there. She had schoolwork and insisted on being old enough to be left at home unattended. Plus, Alba's swim meets bored her. She didn't feel like she should go. And Alvaro agreed. He didn't want to go either, but he had just dropped out of college again. It was the third time this year. And he didn't feel like he had much in the way of an argument. He had been lolling about the house, had been signing away empanadas at the club, had vague thoughts of taking up architecture. Dad could talk him through the math. They'd figure out what was wrong with him, why he couldn't make himself go to classes, why he cried when there was no reason to cry. The day had barely made it to noon. The trip from Barranquilla to Ibagué, barely clear of the dead fish smell of the coast. The sun in full force when the girl tapped on the glass with her enormous gun. A gun, he'd tell you later, not a rifle. The girl with the gun asked them to please step out of the car. She was calm, she was polite, she wore a bandana over the lower half of her face. The girl with the gun had hazel eyes, like Carmen. It was just Alvaro and his baby sister, Alba, and mom and dad, and scores of other families, strangers all, everyone dazed and calm and stepping out of their cars like it was normal and no big deal. It did look normal. It looked, for all the world, like a routine roadblock, an ordinary traffic stop. The military set them up to look for guerrillas, but the guerrillas set them up just as often to look for likely kidnapping targets. And now that the guerrillas were on the run, now that their world crumbled, you didn't know who it was. Maybe common criminals or paramilitary, or who knows? And that's what he'll try to tell you, what he'll say to you, what he can only whisper, that he did not know, had no idea. One roadblock was indistinguishable from the other. Everyone used the same prefabricated pieces to build the structure, the same smoothly swinging steel and rope arm blocking the road, the same procedure for pulling people out of the car. The family joined the crowd, gathering by the shoulder of the road on a lazy curb overlooking a valley, a low flattened cup of green and mist. Time refused to settle nicely into the story when he told it to you. And now you're having the same problem. It all happened all at once. He told it in the wrong order. He got the names wrong. He asked you to remember that he was not named after his own father, that Alvaro wasn't actually his name, but that he had done his best to think of himself as Alvaro, to call himself Alvaro, that he'd explain it to you later. And then he forgot to tell you why. He knew that they left early in the morning, that they had been stopped near noon, but by the curving road, it was already late in the afternoon. The sun was already giving up. His sister's swim meet wouldn't be till tomorrow. They had time, they could still make it, even if this lasted however long it was supposed to last. His mother stood in front of him and held his sister's shoulders. Alba was 10, old enough to know what was going on. She cried, but when they decided to move closer to the edge, she did so calmly. His father too was calm. He whispered, "It's going to be all right. They do these all the time." He wanted to ask if they'd be interested in Dad and the family, because Dad worked for the oil company, but he knew better. Dad worked research and development and had done graduate work in the States, but the family had no money, none whatsoever. The girl who waved them toward the crowd with her gun was not much older than Carmen, 16, maybe 17. She could hold a gun, she could point with it, she could presumably shoot it, but she was so tiny. His parents had spent the bulk of their lives traveling. The family lived in Curaçao and spoke some Dutch, spoke some Papiamento. They lived in Venezuela in the middle of a jungle, a workers' camp, dad an engineer for the hydroelectric dam. They spent some time in the States when dad was finishing up his PhD and returned to Colombia only at the insistence of mom's extended family and mom herself. They missed her. They wanted them here. Grandchildren included. They'd been gypsies too long. "Come home," said the family. "We don't belong here." He wanted to tell the girl with the gun, "We never have." They hadn't spent enough time in this country to be kidnapped. A guerrilla rode the back of a Kawasaki and through a megaphone told the crowd to face the field. Another Kawasaki followed, lime green, where another guerrilla, an open laptop dangling, checked the license plates of the dead cars. Alvaro thought they have a database. There was some relief in knowing that much because his family did not have money. They could barely afford to get him to college, which they could not have done at all without Ecopetrol's sizable subsidy, and they could afford to get him a doctor. They'd made the appointment, they'd figure out what was wrong with him, and his parents constantly fretted about affording anything, and now they fretted about him dropping out, about what troubled him. They told him, you can tell us anything, and he kept quiet, cried. He couldn't get himself to classes, didn't even know what was wrong with him. It was his first time alone, away from home, and now he was at home again. He was home again, a big disappointment. They went out for dinner and his parents fretted. His sister or him signed for an empanada at the country club. They fretted and traveled, never staying wholly fixed in one place. So they had nothing in the way of savings. He'd hear their parents talk about money, argue about it, that they should have stayed put, that they should have saved. His dad whispered, if they start shooting, roll down the hill and act dead. He nodded and whispered the same thing to Alba, grateful that Carmen wasn't there. She wouldn't whisper, wouldn't act, she'd fight, she'd yell. Alba nodded and whispered the same words to their mom, and she cried the whole time, but she did so quietly. They faced the fields. A foot from him, a trucker left the crowd and sat on the edge of the highway, and the guerrilla zipped past with his megaphone and told him to get back, which the trucker did, but like lazily, slowly. A man having a hard time taking the men with the guns seriously. The truckers laughed and huddled and moved about and had no problem engaging in conversation. They must have seen the fear on Alvaro's face and on the faces of his whole family because they tried to reassure them. The truckers told them that this route was stopped all the time, that they hardly took anyone in these fishing expeditions, and that half the time it was what the guerrillas love to call, quote, information campaigns, unquote. One of the chiefs talking at them for like 3 hours about land redistribution and Marxist ideology. The men in the Kawasaki handed out booklets on their history and encouraged you to read and take notes and ask questions. That the captive audience was thanked for their time and released unharmed. He wanted to ask, the Kawasaki, I'm gonna make sure, yeah, the Kawasaki roared past again, and the megaphone told the trucker to shut it. The trucker waved them off, laughed. The day waned, the air cool and gentle. Alvaro shivered. He'd been shivering earlier too, when it was hot and humid. Mom shivered too. So did his sister, his dad. If they shoot, burrow under the bodies, act dead. He thought, my whole family will do the same. We'll be fine. The trucker told us we'd be fine. The trucker would know, he'd been here before. The moon crawled out, too bright, the field overlooking the valley clear in the horizon, as was a sky choking with stars. The world turned dark blue and silver blue and placid. Even the quick rip of gunfire sounded unrushed, brief, distant. Laughter burst in the throng of civilians, so the gunfire didn't feel that serious. Not to him, not to them. Hundreds of their own kind gathered by the side of the road. The kind of people who carried no guns, who did what people with guns told them to do. Nothing to worry about. The trucker told them the only thing to worry about was the military, because when the military intervened, things got bloody. But then the trucker drew their attention to the heartbeat and the murmur of distant helicopters. The trucker said, they're far. They know what they're doing. They're not going to endanger us. The landscape stretched flat. There was nothing to worry about. Alvaro could stop shivering. And that was when they called his father's name on the megaphone. So I'm going to stop right there. And I'm going to go ahead and read oh yeah, we're good. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read a story. It is forthcoming in a book, in this book right here. The book is out. It's called Small Odysseys. It'll be out on March 15. It's just a bunch of really, really short stories from a bunch of really, really cool people that are then going to be performed by a bunch of actors in New York and then broadcast on NPR a little bit later in selected shorts. So I'll just read my story. It's super quick. And then I'm just so excited to get to talk to Angelica and to everybody. So the story is called Cerati After Cerati. The questions came up as soon as a writer heard that Gustavo was Venezuelan. Did he miss his family? Was it as bad as everyone said? What was it like being alone and a young man and away from the people he loved? Gustavo kept the music loud enough to discourage conversation, kept to the same playlist. Since he arrived in Chicago, he used to tell people the truth. His family was safe, mom and dad in Chile, and his sister in Madrid. He used to say Venezuela was worse than everyone thought. Americans, he learned, gave you a great deal of sympathy if you told the truth, but they tipped you less. Now he lied and said that he had a child, a 4-year-old, that he smuggled out of the country and into Colombia. He was saving up to fly him to the States. That's why the Uber. This time, the writer spoke Spanish. Her name was Patricia. You're Venezuelan, she said. Her accent so neutral that it could have been Colombian or even Chilean. How did she know? He hadn't said a thing. Maybe it was his accent, his skin, his clothes. Patricia lost interest after he got to the imaginary kid, asked where in Colombia, what city? Oh, he said he's in an orphanage, Bucaramanga. Nice town, she said. He must be lonely. You too. It's not so lonely, he said. He turned up the music. I've got the songs. Patricia wouldn't tip, or she wouldn't tip well. It would be a long ride. They had made it to the intersection of Milwaukee and Damon. They had to get to Pulaski. The turn signal clicked. He had to make a left, and he'd have to make it on a red light, the only way that you could actually take a left in Chicago. It was close to midnight, the bars aglow, the cold of the night seeping into the car. That's Soda Stereo, Patricia said. That wasn't so terrible. To meet a possible bad tipper who knew about the Argentinian band every South American grew up with. He wanted to tell Patricia about the playlist. Mostly, she reminded him of Maria Lucia, the woman who had helped him make the playlist. The two women had the same black hair, the same long nose. He didn't know how to start, didn't know how to tell Patricia that Maria Lucia was almost certainly dead. A diabetic, low on insulin, in a country with no insulin. They had met in Playa Colorada. They had both heard about a boat that smuggled people out. A crazy route from the beach to Isla Mariposa to Curacao. No luck, a local told them. The ship had sunk days before. Others had come to, 20 or so, none surprised by the bad news. They huddled in improvised shelters. Maria Lucia meant to go to the Colombian border, cross over in Cucuta, wouldn't listen to Gustavo about the horrors he'd heard. She wouldn't make it, not on foot. So what, Maria Lucia said, I go back to Caracas. I'll die there too. She agreed to stay the night. The rest had fallen asleep. Maria Lucia said that she missed just hearing songs about the day MTV Latino hit cable, about all the rock en español. Maria Lucia said that she and her twin sister played Soda Stereo albums all the time. They weren't identical twins, she explained. Her sister was prettier. They knew the entire Soda Stereo catalog, every version of En la Ciudad de la Furia. You could absolutely fill a playlist with just Soda Stereo songs, which Gustavo and Maria Lucia would have done if both their phones weren't close to being dead. Maria Lucia had a ballpoint and a notebook. They wrote the playlist on the back, right by a column of numbers and dates, her sugar levels probably. They wrote down the title of every Soda Stereo song they loved. To remember like a better Venezuela. Maria Lucia was gone in the morning, but she left the list of songs tucked in Gustavo's shirt pocket. He found it weeks later when he was scrambling. His cousin had gotten him a plane ticket. They'd found him space in a garden apartment in Edgewater. He'd have to share it with the other Venezuelan refugees. And there was this quasi-legal loophole where you could work just driving around. And he kept the playlist, the last scrap of his life as a Venezuelan. And the band wasn't even Venezuelan. He typed it up song by song into Spotify. It was kind of a miracle how Spotify managed to find every song. Spotify populated the list with more songs, some from last year, just Cerati, solo songs, no more Soda Stereo. The band had broken up. Gustavo wasn't sure when. Cerati was welcome. His voice a reminder of a time when living didn't seem impossible. There was even a Cerati song from 2018 that was a mournful commentary on his country, on the tragedy of Maduro and Chavez. And it was so good to know that an Argentinian rock star cared. And that's what he was telling Patricia as he drove her, how much he loved Cerati's new songs. That can't be him, Patricia said. It is, he said. Another intersection called a smear of streetlight and snow. He tapped the screen. Cerati, 2019 in parentheses. He died in 2014, Patricia said. You knew that. Gustavo did not know that. He was in a coma. She laughed, and the laughter brought him back to the beach, to Maria Lucia, in the shadow of the car, in the shadow of the beach. You could mistake one woman for the other. Sisters, practically. She said, Cerati went into a coma in 2010. He died in 2014. You can look it up. The light had just turned green. He could not look it up. He's not dead, Gustavo said. You men, Patricia said, so sure. You think you know everything. She shifted, her forehead and hair blocking the rear view mirror, like you know who's alive, who's dead. You can't write a song if you're dead, he said. He's dead, Patricia said. Gustavo didn't know if he believed her. The songs kept coming. Another solo song from an album that came out in 2014, the title a joke if Patricia was telling the truth, Hora de Relajarse. They passed Dulcelandia, the Mexican party supply store. The window display lit up. Every piñata pressed against the window, ready to get out. They were so close. The moment he dropped her off, there'd be somebody else in wait, another stranger, another destination. He'd have to resurrect his imaginary son all over again. He would check about Cerati's death. Though now he remembered his cousin talking about how strange Cerati's coma had been, how sad and unexpected, how even the Swedish band Roxette paid Cerati tribute. Roxette toured Chile in 2012 and covered the Música Ligera. Singers never quite died, the Swedes said. Their music lived on. The playlist moved on to an old song, thank God, Disco Eterno. Cerati sang that he had slipped out of context, that it was better to slip away, to put on a song that played on a loop forever. So to be a spirit, a ghost that is sometimes very sure and at other times uncertain. That's my stop, Patricia said. Gustavo slowed down. The map on the phone had frozen, uncertain. He parked by a bar with large windows, the interior visible through large display windows, the shadows inside black and red and full of life. He turned off the playlist. Music poured out of the bar. An old merengue song that his parents loved. He clicked on the interior lights, got a good look at the woman in the back. You're the sister, he said. You are Patricia's sister. Patricia's waiting in the bar, Maria Lucia said. He could see the sister. Merengue played, Patricia danced alongside other Venezuelans, strangers all, and kin. He did not expect to feel so happy. He did not expect to identify Cerati so clearly, but Cerati had this very distinctive cloud of hair, and he was there too, dancing. Gustavo had forgotten about the phone, about how he could check and see if what Patricia had told him was the truth. She was getting out. Gustavo had not been invited. He had so many questions for Patricia, for Maria Lucia. The dancers inside seemed to be waving, but it was just a dance move. You know, the sort you did all together as a crowd. Gustavo wanted to join. He was so lonely. He'd forgotten how lonely he was. And he really didn't know if it was okay, what the etiquette was. If a lone and living Venezuelan could find refuge among all these joyous dancing dead. And that's it.
Thank you for sharing those two pieces with us, Juan. They were very lovely to hear. If anyone has wants to start asking questions, you can go ahead and just put in the chat, and then we'll call on whoever wants to ask. I think I already see Carla. Do you have a question? I saw the little hand icon. But okay, so Professor Grimes has a question, so we can start with him.
Wow, thank you both so much. I really enjoyed that. Juan, I had a question because, you know, I was thinking from the first story and into the second story, I was wondering, the word that kept on coming to mind was internal displacement, or the phrase. And then I was thinking, I wonder what your thoughts were, conceptually speaking, about the relationship between internal displacement and displacement, or social displacement, or social internal displacement. That's just the word that kept on coming to mind.
Christopher, thank you so much. That's such a wonderful question, and one that I've been, I think that it's something that I've been trying to figure out for like the last couple of years, right? How do you write about, you know, place when you're feeling like the place is shifting from under you, right? And what is the experience of doing so when, you know, how do you capture that accurately when you yourself are actually mostly doing okay, which I think is brings a bunch of weird ethical stuff about it. But like the thing that I will say about like the ways in which I felt I could do justice to both of the sort of situations that are coming up is that the precipitating factor in that in the novel excerpt, the first reading, is something that happened to me and my family. So it was like, I'm just going to see if I can figure out what I remember and what I can. And then the other one was the other one happened to my uncle. He had to make a kind of like a really harrowing journey out of Venezuela for very obvious reasons fairly recently. So I was able to talk to him a little bit about what that was. And then part of the thing that I find interesting is that the story and the novel excerpt end up sort of finding anchors in the US, like finding like, I mean, one of my very, very favorite things about the story is that I had not actually come across the piñata store until I was on my way somewhere. I think I went in, it was in the middle of the night, and then you're seeing all these piñatas on the, you're close to Pulaski. It just made me so happy. So it's this really weird thing is like, right, if you're feeling like everything is shifting from under you, what are the things that become kind of meaningful and beautiful? And a lot of it has to do with like both the sensory beauty of just being alive, but also like the weird stuff that you carry with you that gives you meaning, right? Like that like Soda Stereo, which is like, I should have said this before, but Cerati is actually a real person who really did that, you know. And Soda Stereo is a great band. If anybody, I just realized that there may be a few people here who know them, but yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if that was an answer or just like a veering into.
No, it really does. It was a beautiful answer. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I actually also had a question for you, Juan, kind of going off this idea of, you know, a displacement type of thing. I noticed in the first part that you read from the novel, there was this line that really struck with me, and that was the line of, they hadn't spent enough time in this country to get kidnapped. And it just, and I wonder, you know, because I see this theme of home and what home is evident in your short story collection, and then also in the other excerpt that you read with us today. And so I wondered if you could elaborate on how, you know, your own experience or the experience of, like you said, family members as well, plays into incorporating this either lack of home or belonging, or ever kind of like nomad type of a situation in your writing itself as well.
Angelica, it's such a really, really interesting question, and this is one of the ones that I've sort of been struggling with for a long time. And I'm going to actually flip it back to you in a moment and ask you how you feel about like navigating issues of like feeling fixed or shifting away, because I think it's so one of the things that I think I felt was sort of like a defining aspect of my own life is that we sort of shuttled back and forth between Colombia and the US a bit, right? My dad came here for school, and then we went back, and then he decided he wanted to go back to school, and so we all went back. So there was this sort of like shifting, and it, you know, meant that when I would go back to Colombia, I would talk with an accent, and then I'd go back to the US and I'd talk with an accent, right? And I think the one thing that made me, especially as a teenager, I was completely convinced that, oh my God, I am like, nobody's ever had to do this, right? Nobody's ever had to deal with the fact that I have to, you know, like, that I'm not at home in Colombia and then I'm not at home in the US. And then I've talked to people who have been in their hometowns their whole lives, and they're like, fucking hate my hometown, I don't belong here, nobody understands me. And then I started realizing, oh, okay, that's a lot of us. It's a lot of us who don't feel like we are at home, right? Either in an actual geographical place or in our own skins, or yeah. And so like that's part of, I think, the impulse to write about it. I mean, and then I think I've been trying a little bit in the collection, a little bit later on in other things, to sort of be acknowledge the fact that there are certain things that do feel like home, like definitely food, right? There's certain foods that are home, and that's yeah. And how would you, you know, because I mean, we even in the story that in this, you know, excerpt that you read, there is also that feeling of somebody who is shifting and not fully feeling like they're there with the you know, in that workplace under those circumstances. So how would you answer that?
I'm not sure I've found an answer for that yet. But yeah, I think similarly, I've always been grappling and fascinated by this question of where is home. So I was born here, but I did live in Mexico, and then my family immigrated here to the US. And so there's always kind of been this like state of flux, you know, where like even what town is home, because even here it's been multiple places. And so that's one of the things that I am interested in pursuing within my work as well, this exploration of, is there a home, or is there just kind of this limbo, is what I kind of think about it as. And I think like you said, there are other instances where even people who grow up in the same town their whole lives still feel out of place and also trapped in this limbo, which I think, there's a few characters in your short story collection that also embody that without having ever been anywhere else. But yeah, I see it as this limbo, and I try to figure out how can I explore this concept of a limbo in fiction. And I think I also explore it in poetry as well. But yeah, it's just something that really fascinates me. And I don't think that there's a concrete answer for what to do with this limbo or how to even express it fully. But just kind of exploring in different forms and formats, especially, is what I tend to do.